Hi everyone, and welcome to the QDU Academy session for Year 12, Round 3. This one will be preparing for the long prep topic that politicians should have to use public services while in office, for example, health, education, and transport. A brief overview of what we'll be looking at. We'll take a look at some debate context first, then setup, then brainstorming points, and finally some general tips, especially how to do trade-offs and characterization, which will be particularly important for this topic. Firstly, then, context. I think the political system has always been a very topical issue because politics affects everyone's daily lives. However, I think the responsibility and the trust that we can put in our politicians has become a particularly important topic within the past couple of years. With public emergencies like coronavirus and more recently the rapidly rising cost of living, I think it is more important now than ever that we reconsider whether our politicians that we have chosen and the politicians that we continue to put our trust in, can accurately represent the interests of the average person. Obviously, this is an issue that is not limited to our current day and age, or not only limited to Australia. So take a look at some research for a couple of different areas to see whether politicians are very tuned to the average daily person's life, or whether they are quite distanced from this. In terms of the importance of the context, have a think about why this was set as a topic, and more specifically, for both affirmative and negative teams, what is the problem? Have a think about what the cause of the main problem within this debate will be, what are the main effects of this problem, and also what is the scale of this problem. Scale is particularly important for both teams to consider because obviously a more severe problem justifies a more drastic solution. However, this also means that if you choose to characterize the problem in this way, this means you will have to do a lot more work because obviously a bigger problem is quite a bit harder to solve. Then, in terms of setup. In terms of approaching setup, the first question to consider is what type of debate this topic is. Have a think about whether this is a policy debate, where we are implementing some sort of policy, where we are changing something in the world, or whether this is an empirical topic, where we are debating whether something is true or not, whether it is good or bad. Then have a think about if this is this type of topic, what sort of setup does this require from the affirmative or negative team? So obviously this is a policy topic because we are implementing some sort of change, and this means that we need the usual definition from the affirmative team, and we will also be needing a model. So in terms of definitions, the first thing to ask is what are the key words which need to be defined? We can identify this in a bunch of different ways. The main ones that we may identify is politicians, remembering that for definitions, we are not asking for dictionary definitions, but instead a brief summary of the most important things. Think about how you want to frame the role of politicians in a way that will make it very favorable and strategic for the rest of your case. Then you might want to have a think about public services, and in defining public services, you may also want to give a brief description of the main alternative to public services. Finally, have a think about what the term in office means and how this changes the way you should set up for this topic. Then models and countermodels. Affirmative teams will require a model in this debate. Have a think about what politicians this should apply to. So obviously the main purpose of a model is to answer the questions in terms of how you are going to implement this particular change that are not directly answered by the topic itself. One of those questions is which politicians this model should apply to. So have a think about whether you want this to apply to all politicians, national, state, and also local as well, or whether you would make some exemptions. This decision should be made with consideration to how you have chosen to characterize the problem. A more drastic problem requires a more drastic solution, so it would likely require a more wide-ranging model. Then also have a think about what particular services this is going to apply to. Will you choose to make any exemptions or not? Make sure that you are very careful when you're making decisions about your model. A model should always be strategic. You are not going to be able to solve every single problem in the world with a model. However, you can make sure that you do not make any big overreaches or any big mistakes with the particular terms of a model. If you are on the negative, you may choose to include a countermodel, or otherwise you can simply argue for the status quo as the best option. In terms of considering whether or not to include a countermodel, have a think about whether there is a certain problem within the status quo and whether there is an alternative way to solve this problem that is advisable instead of the affirmative teams model. In considering this, it is very important to consider what the status quo looks like. Even if there are small problems, perhaps the status quo is far better than any alternative. Then, in terms of brainstorming points. So, first thing, as always, to consider is if you woke up tomorrow in this world, what do you think would change? Have a think about how different stakeholders would react. Perhaps most importantly, put yourself into the shoes of a politician. How would your life change? What different considerations may you need to prioritize instead? Some of the clashes to think around are firstly, equality. Do you believe that politicians are privileged? How do public services differ from private services? Who is likely to use public services? Are these people particularly vulnerable? How do they compare to politicians? Public services. What are the key issues that we face in the status quo with public services? Are they likely to be solved or worsened by this policy? What sorts of legislation might politicians try and implement in order to improve public services, and are they likely to be very effective? Finally, then, legislation. So this is talking about politicians and the sorts of changes they will make in government that will have impacts on public services because public services are provided by the government. So, in terms of legislation, and this is how both teams may claim lots of different benefits and harms, have a think about what sorts of factors affect politicians' decision making. What sorts of policies are politicians likely to suggest now? Are there any particular incentives that may act against this or may support this? Briefly then, in terms of the types of services that we may want to take a look at within this debate, we have public and private services as the main division. So public services are those provided by the government to fulfill essential needs, typically for free or at a heavily subsidized cost. This is primarily because the government recognizes that they have an obligation to provide some sort of essential goods to even the most vulnerable in society, that even if you are not able to afford these services, they are incredibly important for the quality of your life, so the government is willing to spend money in order to provide this. The main examples, as listed by the topic, are public health services, so that's public hospitals, so on and so forth, public schools, and also public transport, so buses and trains and such. On the other hand, as the main alternative to this, we have private services. So private services fulfill these same needs, however, they are provided by private companies. The key thing here is that private services are typically, since they are provided by corporations, they run on a profit motive, and this means that people need to pay in order to get these services, and oftentimes this is quite expensive. So this includes things like private hospitals or private health insurance, this includes private schools, and perhaps as the main alternative to public transport that is private, cars. Have a think about questions like how many people are accessing each of these services, and also the key differences between these services. This looks like considering things like affordability, so who can afford each type of service, who do we care more about? Have a think about accessibility. Are these services equally accessible from all different types of areas? Are there perhaps issues with people, for example, living in rural areas trying to access things like public transport? Will this apply to politicians? Then have a think about things like quality, and speed as well. So, for example, one of the big problems that is commonly identified by the media with the public health service is that there are significantly long wait times because lots of people use public hospitals. Have a think about how this could possibly be fixed, whether it can be fixed, and what sort of advantage this would be, whether this is really big or perhaps small. These are questions that are important to consider regardless of whether you are on the affirmative or negative team, because obviously this will underlie the vast majority of your arguments, and this is also very important to consider in your rebuttal as well. Finally, in terms of points, have a think about stakeholders. Thinking of stakeholders is a really excellent way to brainstorm a greater variety of points and also making sure that you impact effectively. For anyone that doesn't know, impacting means that we are talking about the importance of a point. So obviously you can have a really good argument, but it is quite meaningless to the adjudicator unless you prove that it is important, that it affects many people, or that it affects important groups of people. So for stakeholders, first off, just have a simple think about who is affected by this debate. Then, among those people, who do we care the most about? Why do we care the most about them? Do you think this will be the same for both the affirmative or negative team? If you think this is going to be different, it is quite worth preempting how you can prove to the adjudicator that the negative team or the affirmative team, your opposition's most important stakeholder, is not as important as yours, so on and so forth. Finally, I think it is very important to consider what sort of different factors affect different stakeholders' decision-making calculus. That's because debating is primarily about arguing how different changes are going to affect different sorts of people, and oftentimes the vast majority of these changes occur secondhand by influencing different people's decisions and making them make slightly different decisions. So, we might identify that one of the key stakeholders within this debate are politicians. So have a think about what sorts of factors might affect a politician's decision making. What sort of background are they likely to come from? How is this going to affect their views? Whose interests are they representing? Does this differ for different parties, or is this likely to be the same for all politicians? Some general tips then. First off, in terms of trade-offs. A trade-off is when you argue at the end of a point or an issue that your impact is ultimately a lot more important than a different impact that is achieved by the opposition. For example, you might argue that saving 10 children is more important than saving 100 puppies, despite children not being the same as puppies and 10 obviously not being the same as 100. We need to have some sort of equivalence or not equivalence between these two things for the adjudicator to be able to make their decision. Trade-offs are particularly important in debates where the benefits of each team likely will not overlap. A couple of the metrics by which you can prove that one impact is more important than another. You can talk about the number of people affected. For example, do we care more about inconveniencing a couple of politicians, or do we care more about providing better services for the entire population of Australia? Other things that we can consider is the severity of the effect. For example, slight inconvenience versus death, so on and so forth. Final thing is the vulnerability of a particular stakeholder. Are they able to protect themselves? Are they particularly powerful or particularly weak? Will harming them in this specific way plunge them into further disadvantage? Do they have the power to come out of these situations by themselves? Important thing to note at the end of this, you should try to win the debate on multiple different grounds on both your metrics and the opposition's metrics as well. However, trade-offs are very useful, especially towards the end of the debate, if you think the opposition is doing really well on a particular issue and you think it will be very difficult for you to also win on this issue. Lastly, in terms of characterization, remember to give reasons why your characterization, so your depiction of the world and how things work in the world, is true. For example, when you are characterizing politicians, give lots of reasons why they might think in particular ways. For example, a couple of questions to think around. What are some reasons why politicians may not adequately understand problems within the public service system? Who is likely to become a politician? What sort of education, wealth, or background are they likely to come from? Why is this true? Then, what motivations and incentives is their decision making impacted by? This can range around, but is not only limited to representation of the people, empathy to the different sorts of people they are interacting with, their friends, their family, or random people on the train, party loyalty, so their obligations to the party that they have campaigned with, and also those future interests of getting re-elected, so on and so forth. And finally, economic interests. This is particularly important when considering things like sponsorships for parties and how parties are financed in the Australian political system. Finally, how will their views change, positively or negatively, based on this? This is, for example, particularly an opportunity for the negative team to have a think about what sorts of things are very easy to try and what sorts of opinions are very easy to change, or perhaps certain opinions are very difficult to change within people because they are really ingrained and concreted. Maybe people are highly likely to react negatively to certain things, so on and so forth. Maybe the situation will be worsened and far worse than the status quo. Please note that we have lots of different resources within our YouTube page, for example, a couple of practice debates and also specific videos regarding practical points and principle points and different things within debating. Please feel free to refer to these if you have any questions and would like more awareness around these different topics. Thank you so much for listening.